Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for inviting me to this prestigious conference. My topic was just named, and I will begin reading my paper. In this paper, I'm going to use evolutionary theory as well as evolutionary culture theory in order to throw the door open for understanding aspects of violent behavior. Regarding this general problem, it is important to draw our attention to reciprocity, one of the foundations of human sociality. According to Alvin Gouldner, a sociologist, and I'm quoting him, the norm of reciprocity holds that people should help those who have helped them, unquote. And therefore, those whom you have helped have an obligation to help you. This obligation seems to be a key to understanding various aspects of violent behavior. With respect to violence, we should, however, take a qualification into account, because recent findings indicate that in the course of natural selection, there were in fact two species having recourse to organized violence for getting hold of resources for their group's livelihood. We heard in the morning from Professor Spielmann about it. Both of them are primate species, that is the chimpanzees of Tanzania, as well as the human species. When Jane Goodall, the world's leading expert on chimpanzees, visited the Gombe region, and I'm quoting here, she encountered the gradual extermination of one group of animals by another stronger group. According to Lund, this aggression, and I'm quoting him, included looks of hate aroused by the sight of an enemy, cannibalism of infants, and victory displays, unquote. These are important findings demonstrating that chimps, I'm quoting Turner and Moransky, are going to defend their territory with organized violence, unquote. Furthermore, it is an indication of these primate species' genetic similarity, contrasting it with aggressive drives in a multitude of species whose sociality is different from both species. According to Goodall's findings, and I'm quoting her again, one tribe was obliterated, losing 1 square mile of territory to the attacking tribe, unquote. Turning to an explanation of chimps' behavior, Hubert Markel points out that, I'm quoting here, the primary focus of aggression lies in privileged access to resources. In fact, there wouldn't be a selective advantage in looking around for competitors, unquote. Since time and energy are precious resources for any individual, it wouldn't pay looking for unnecessary fights. Obviously, aggressive behavior has been selected for privileged access to resources as well as for finding mates for reproduction, which is true for both primate species and for all others as well. Regarding chimps' behavior, Wrangham and Peterson point out that male chimpanzees stay in their native groups, whereas females move to neighboring groups. It seems, and I'm quoting Wrangham and Peterson, they are forming aggressive coalitions with each other in mutual support against the others. So far, Wrangham and Peterson, and that, I'm quoting again, related men routinely fight in defense of their group. Therefore, it seems, I'm quoting again, that chimpanzees and Homo sapiens share male-driven lethal intergroup raiding, unquote, in order to promote individual fitness. This type of aggression evolved because it allowed participants to promote their fitness by gaining access to reproductive resources, that is to females. For experts in the field, This boils down to negating the Seville Statement on Violence, which insists, and I'm quoting here, it is scientifically incorrect to say there has been a selection for aggressive behavior more than for other kinds of behavior, unquote. This is a quote from Grobel and Hein from 1989. Unlike this statement, and I'm quoting here Summit, the accepted ethological view is that as our species evolved, there was indeed selection for aggression, unquote. Moreover, also again quoting Summit, from man to mouse, with few exceptions, the male of the species is more aggressive than the female. Humans are no exception to this general zoological principle, unquote. After these introductory remarks, I'm now turning to violent behavior in hunter and gatherer hordes, the primeval human society. This type of society originated in the dawn of human existence, and in some regions it still exists. Instead of enumerating a multitude of hordes, I'm going to bring into focus reports about some of these hordes, as well as the reasons why they possibly adhered to violence. Before embarking upon this sketch, it should be emphasized that that evolutionary theory accentuates, it underlines, sexual reproduction, and aggression is only instrumental for that purpose. Since men and women obey to different reproductive roles, their part in physical aggression is also different. According to Wrangham and Peterson, I'm quoting again, natural selection favored high-risk behavior in men, whereas women were mostly concerned with their offspring. This description may seem awkwardly archaic as compared to our present situation, but in those days, people were exposed to dangerous animals such as wolves and lions, and it was risky for females, I'm quoting Turner and Mariansky, it was risky for females to confront toothed prey while carrying vulnerable infants, unquote. In the next paragraph, I'm going to present 3 examples of violent behavior among tribal people. According to Napoleon Chagnon, an American anthropologist, the villages of the Yanomami in the Orinoco region were engaged in nearly incessant warfare. Besides material booty, which was occasionally captured, women were abducted in these wars, who in due course became warriors' wives. Similar causes were also reported for the Jivaro of Ecuador, and according to Hana, individuals who had taken heads from slain warriors were respected as powerful men, for whom the privilege of marriage with a number of women, not only one, a number of women was reserved. In a similar report about the Munduruku, another South American tribe, Durham explains that people honored those warriors who had succeeded resources for the tribe and therefore were granted permission to marry a number of women. Finally, according to paleohistorical reports about a mass murder that occurred some 7,000 years ago at Thalheim, a village close to Heilbronn in Germany, demonstrates that while men and children were killed, whereas the village's women were abducted. So far, a similar causation as in the other tribes. In total, it seems that the majority of the people concerned showed an attitude as if they knew what the inbreeding depression was all about. The underlying problem is, if people from a given group marry, I'm quoting Turner and Mariansky, marry their neighbor's son or daughter for one generation after the other, here comes the quote, it would not take many generations before most individuals were too close genetically, triggering inbreeding depression. So far the quote. In general, the social sciences refer to this phenomenon as the incest taboo. Therefore, it seems that marrying women from outside groups was a clever use of genetic knowledge even prior to having taken a single lesson in biology. Unfortunately, however, the coincidences between chimps and human tribes regarding the abduction of women is only part of the story. Recently, Cosmides and Tooby created a modern myth, according to which the abduction of women was the primary target of foraging society's warfare. In contrast to this myth, van der Dennen explains that, I'm quoting here, Yanomamo inter-village raids are almost never conducted with the explicit intent of capturing women. And in most primitive wars, and I'm quoting again van der Dennen, primitive peoples indiscriminately kill everybody, men, women, and children, unquote. As for the effects of primitive war, Livingston explains that the overall death toll of young males in the various hordes was about 28%. Pretty high, in fact. Turning to additional causes of violent behavior, Böhm notes that blood revenge was common among these hordes. And I'm quoting Böhm here, if a warrior quickly retaliated to kill the killer of his born brother, the ambivalence was likely to be minimized because of the strong, highly immediate personal motive of revenge, unquote. If, however, the vengeance was taken years later, ambivalence was much greater. The gravity of the situation was even more increased when, as in the case of the Angkor in New Guinea, a kinsman's death was attributed to sorcery or witchcraft originating from alien hordes. As a consequence, incessant feuding was brought about, to which no solution was available in stateless society. As pointed out in the introduction, reciprocity explains why people are prepared to take vengeance for people from their own family. According to Daly and Wilson, the institution of blood revenge was designed to protect one's own kin. And it seems that the institution exists to the present day in various parts of the world. Even if it's somewhat of a nuisance addressing methodological problems in the present context, it should be noted that strictly materialistic notions of resources to bring about erroneous assumptions regarding motivations for warfare. In this regard, I would like to introduce a terse statement on this topic. To put it briefly, I'm quoting here, people don't fight for resources, but for ideas of resources. Some of these ideas are closer to the real importance of these resources in terms of metabolic needs. Others are more distant from such realistic assessment. This is a quotation from myself. As pointed out by Ferguson, there is no direct causation between resources and their use in competing societies. The land which had been competed for between diverse hordes might be spirit-infested and therefore would be useless for one of the competitors. Accordingly, war is never a simple function of the environment, so far Ferguson. Finally, two more general causes should be also noted. The first is ethnocentrism, which according to Shaw and Wong is a cultural institution. The second institution is ostracism, which was used against clan members if a particular individual, and I'm quoting here, disrupted the cooperative system of the group. if a member of a group committed an act likely to provoke reprisals, then he or she would be expelled from the group. I'm turning now to the advent of the state and its implications for collective violence. The evolution of the state brought about dramatic changes in the tactical organization of violent behavior. According to evolutionary culture theory, this process started in the Fertile Crescent, a region between what is now Turkey and the Persian Gulf. As pointed out by Gerald Diamond, the people in this region were accustomed with the wild predecessors of einkorn wheat, of emmer wheat, of barley, of lentils, as well as of goats, horses, cows, and pigs, and eventually set out to domesticate these species. According to Diamond, and I'm quoting here, the world holds only about 148 species of large wild mammalian terrestrial herbivores or omnivores, the large mammals that could be considered candidates for domestication, so far Diamond. And I'm continuing, these produced annual harvests of up to nearly a ton of seeds per hectare can be obtained, yielding 50 calories of food energy for only 1 kilocalorie of wood expended. So far, Diamond. The reason why we shall have to pay attention to this process is that, and I'm turning to Turner and Mariansky, is that fitness was enhanced with new technologies for increasing grain yields, and due to these technologies, the number of individuals in a given society could be augmented. There could be more individuals in this society. Unfortunately, fertile land is comparatively scarce, and therefore, and I'm quoting Schmuckler here, no one is free to choose peace, but anyone can impose upon all the necessity for power. Schmuckler continues, the irony is that successful defense against a power-maximizing aggressor requires a society to become more like the society that threatens it. It seems that power is like a contaminant, a disease which once introduced will gradually, yet inexorably, become universal. So far, my quotation from Schmuckler. According to the general scarcity of resources, social power as well as violent means were decisive for the control of resources within a radius around a center by state officers. In response to power maximizers, people in Jericho in Palestine established one of the first fortifications in the Near East. And according to Roper, I'm quoting here, a garrison with soldiers' quarters provides evidence on centralized control, unquote. Moreover, as pointed out by Sanderson, the distribution of agriculture brought about extreme patterns of social inequality, and I'm quoting here, land is owned or at least controlled either by powerful landlords, by centralized governments, or to some extent by both. As further outlined by Sanderson, militaristic elites took control in Mesopotamia as well as in Peru. The next paragraph is going to outline the economic rationale for power-maximizing societies. As mentioned earlier, there was no inherent need to abandon primitive society, but once a threshold had been crossed, a novel type of society was in expectation. Here are some prerequisites for this new type of society. The first requisite is that an economic surplus should be available for the state, but in the present context, it doesn't matter whether the state was made up of Sumerian priests or by the pharaohs of Egypt. much of the surplus was spent in the establishment of palaces and temples, as well as into standing armies. Turning to the second consequence, since fertile land became an asset in the new economy, the king and his officers set out to conquer as many pieces of fertile land from stateless hordes as possible. Since the well-trained and perfectly equipped soldiers were vastly superior to clan warriors, they were no match for them. And finally, these people also came under the state's dominion. A third consequence was that new levels of social inequality were imported into the new society. As compared to the highly egalitarian primeval hordes, we now find the king, his dynastic background, the different types of elite people such as aristocrats, taxation officers, clergymen, and others being part of the elite strata of society. Regarding the use of violence, aristocratic elites were most influential. As we recall from aristocratic times in Europe, the use of armor and all kinds of weapons were strictly forbidden to ordinary men. However, and I'm quoting Andrasky here, Switzerland was the only country in medieval Europe which was never ruled by the nobility, unquote. Turning to the developments reducing the omnipresence of violence in human societies, the impact of law should be noted. Ever since Sargon of Akkad's days, law existed in the Near East as well as in other regions of the world. But unfortunately, it would be extremely difficult of assessing its impact on everyday behavior. Fortunately, however, Daly and Wilson provide figures regarding the likeliness of falling victim to homicide, of murder in Western Europe. According to these figures, and I'm quoting them here, the homicide rate was enormously higher in the distant past than it is today. English murders appear to have declined more or less steadily over some 700 years or more, so that the modern Englishman faces a risk of not 5% of that which confronted his medieval counterparts. So far, this quotation from the both. And I'm turning now to modern patterns of violence. Having witnessed that risks of life were reduced since the 12th century in Europe, we envisage a contrary course of risks due to the wars of the 19th and 20th centuries. Just as the development of the state got started with an increase in economic surplus, if you recall this, the adoption of industrial production further intensified this surplus, which after the French Revolution was invested in the standing armies of Europe. The situation became even more aggravated by the introduction of compulsory military service all over Europe. And subsequently, warfare became a nationalistic obsession. According to Fuller, Napoleon's conquest, I'm quoting here, his conquest would have been impossible without compulsory military service, and Napoleon boasted himself that he could wear up to 30,000 soldiers per month, unquote. Despite these conquests, the 19th century was the least warlike of any over the last 5 centuries, but compared to the 20th century, and I'm quoting Levi, Walker, and Edwards, war was 3 times more destructive than in the 19th century. So far, these quotations. As for the menace of war in the present situation in Europe and in the Western world, our major competitor for the leading world powers is not visible yet. This could, however, change rapidly if and when new powers will get hold of nuclear arms, thereby endangering the entire global system. Except for direct aggression against the dominant powers, a second scenario probably is the more likely one. In fact, this scenario already has taken place, particularly with the dissolution of formerly leading nations such as the Soviet Union, as well as former Yugoslavia. If ethnocentrism is a real menace to the stability of multi-ethnic states, as Sean Wong suggests, we must ask why this is so. It seems that successful instances such as the USA or Switzerland continue to exist because the benefits to partaking ethnic groups exceeds the costs in terms of self-government. Obviously, this did not work in the case of the former USSR because the state, and I'm quoting here, evolved from a long history of conquest which began with the Tsarist expansion, according to Sean Wong. As pointed out to these authors, the Russians were supposed, and I'm quoting here them again, the most developed on the path to communism. And similar causes could also be pointed out for former Yugoslavia. More recently, however, Chinese officials encountered similar problems with the Uyghurs in the country's western provinces. It remains to be seen how this Asian empire is going to deal with this problem. In conclusion to this chapter, the difference between ethnies and nations should be recapitulated. And I'm quoting here, what distinguishes ethnic groups from other kinds of human alliances is the relative importance of kin recognition mechanisms. This is quotations from Johnson. Whereas nationalism was the most powerful ideology during the 19th and 20th century. I'm turning to my summary. Regarding the evolution of violent behavior, there were two primate species having recourse to organized violence in order for getting hold of resources for their group's livelihood. It was pointed out that chimps used violence in similar ways as humans do, probably with the exception of blood revenge. I haven't heard about this from them. Another aspect lacking in chimpanzees is that they were unable to develop up-to-date weaponry and had to rely on simple sticks and stones. Turning to human affairs, many people hesitate to accept violent solutions because, and I'm quoting Gerhard Lenski here, the great majority of men have always accorded survival the highest priority, unquote. Therefore, there is a lot of ambivalence with respect to violence. In this regard, we should realize Van Creveld's important point on individual interest in war. According to him, it doesn't make sense assuming that people have any particular interest in war, individual soldiers, he means. Given that survival is the individual's real objective, the individual person is going to support war only if he or she is convinced that there is no other solution to a problem. The individual soldier being exposed to war does not have an individual interest in war, but simply obeys orders. With respect to reciprocity, it was important for people in primitive times to include only in-group members into their community. Regarding reciprocity in human groups, people assumed their ancestor obligations and eventually committed blood revenge. In more recent times, when kin selection was partly replaced by the state and recent religious practices, moral retribution was placed upon modern patterns. Despite this replacement, blood revenge and feuding still exist in some parts of the world. But as we saw, in many parts of the world, they were replaced by the rule of law. Obviously, this was only a partial resolution to the problem, because despite the institution of law, millions of people on this continent, I mean Europe, perished in the course of the world wars which began in Europe. As pointed out in this paper, violence is a problem for any type of human society. With respect to violence in human society, legitimate acts of violence have to rely on a particular mythology, differentiating just from unjust deeds. For instance, the Egyptian pharaoh was looked upon as a person, and I'm quoting Sanderson here, who guaranteed and maintained the cosmic order, unquote here. According to Jan Assmann, political violence was legitimized by maintaining this order, while at the same time savage violence was considered as devilish, or in German, teuflisch. Finally, it would be intriguing to demonstrate that the mythology legitimizing monarchies in Europe and other parts of the world were following the example of ancient Egypt. To do this, however, would call for a complete novel story. So far, my paper. Thank you for listening.